The financial landscape of the United States prior to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was characterized by a profound and often chaotic decentralization. This period lacked the centralized banking regulation commonly found in other developed nations, a deficiency that led to significant and recurring economic instability. Private financial institutions, particularly those concentrated on Wall Street, consequently assumed a disproportionately powerful role in controlling the nation's monetary system and attempting to mitigate its frequent crises. The inherent flaws in this unregulated structure ultimately necessitated a fundamental overhaul, culminating in the creation of the Federal Reserve. Historically, the concept of a central bank in the United States faced considerable political resistance. Early attempts to establish such an institution, namely the First Bank of the United States, 1791 to 1811, and the Second Bank of the United States, 1816 to 1836, were met with intense opposition rooted in fears of concentrated power, state sovereignty concerns, and suspicions regarding financial elites. The First Bank, chartered for 20 years, demonstrated some effectiveness in stabilizing the currency and managing government finances, yet its charter was not renewed due to political factionalism and accusations of unconstitutionality. The Second Bank similarly faced strong antagonism, most notably from President Andrew Jackson, who famously vetoed its recharter in 1832, decrying it as a monopolistic entity detrimental to the common man. Its eventual liquidation ushered in a period of unprecedented financial fragmentation. Following the demise of the Second Bank, the United States entered what became known as the free banking era, spanning from 1837 to 1863. This was an extraordinarily decentralized system where virtually any state-chartered bank could issue its own banknotes. Without a federal regulator, the quality and value of these banknotes varied wildly from one institution to another. Banks were often required to back their notes with state bonds, but the value of these bonds fluctuated, and some banks held insufficient reserves or invested in highly speculative ventures. The result was a chaotic currency landscape characterized by thousands of different banknotes, making transactions cumbersome and prone to fraud. The public often struggled to discern legitimate currency from counterfeit, and the notes of distant or less reputable banks traded at significant discounts. This era was marked by frequent bank failures, as institutions found themselves unable to redeem their circulating notes in specie, gold or silver, when confidence eroded. The lack of a uniform currency hindered interstate commerce, exacerbated economic downturns, and fostered an environment of widespread financial distrust. The fundamental problem was a complete absence of a lender of last resort and a mechanism to control the overall money supply, leaving the economy vulnerable to sudden liquidity shortages and runs on banks. The Civil War brought about a crucial, though still incomplete, reform. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created the national banking system, aiming to unify the currency and provide a more stable financial framework. Under this system, nationally chartered banks were established, subject to federal oversight and required to meet specific capital and reserve requirements. These national banks were mandated to purchase U.S. government bonds and could then issue national banknotes backed by these bonds, ensuring a more uniform and secure currency. State banknotes were effectively taxed out of existence, leading to a proliferation of national banks across the country. This system successfully addressed the chaotic currency problem of the free banking era, providing a stable and widely accepted medium of exchange. However, it introduced its own set of significant drawbacks. The primary flaw was its inherent inflexibility. The volume of national banknotes was tied to the amount of government bonds held by banks, and there was no mechanism for the money supply to expand or contract in response to changing economic conditions. During periods of high demand for currency, such as crop harvesting seasons when farmers needed cash to pay laborers and transport goods, the system could not adequately increase liquidity. This led to periodic currency famines and upward pressure on interest rates, especially in agricultural regions. Conversely, during periods of low demand, excess currency could contribute to speculative bubbles. More critically, the system lacked a central authority to provide emergency liquidity during financial panics. Each national bank operated largely in isolation, and when a crisis hit, the inability to quickly inject cash into the system meant that otherwise solvent banks could fail due to a temporary lack of liquidity, triggering a cascade of failures across the financial system. In the profound vacuum left by the absence of a central bank, private financial institutions, particularly those concentrated on Wall Street, naturally ascended to a position of immense influence over the nation's monetary circulation and its overall financial stability. These powerful entities, often led by formidable individuals, found themselves compelled to intervene during times of crisis, essentially acting as de facto central bankers. Their actions, though driven by self-preservation and the protection of their own vast interests, frequently averted complete systemic collapse. This era effectively placed the nation's financial destiny in the hands of a select few private citizens and their syndicates, a situation that, while sometimes effective, was inherently undemocratic, opaque, and prone to conflicts of interest. The sheer scale of their capital and their interconnectedness within the financial world made them indispensable, yet their operations were entirely unregulated by any public authority. The role of figures like J.P. Morgan stands as a stark illustration of this dynamic. Morgan, a towering figure in American finance, repeatedly played a decisive role in stabilizing markets during moments of extreme panic. His most famous intervention occurred during the Panic of 1907, a crisis that vividly exposed the critical vulnerabilities of the existing financial system. As the panic unfolded, triggered by a failed speculation in copper stocks and a subsequent run on trust companies, the New York banking system faced imminent collapse. There was no government agency, no central bank, capable of providing the necessary liquidity to stem the tide of withdrawals. In this dire situation, Morgan took charge. He convened leading New York bankers in his library, effectively locking them in until they agreed to pool their resources and commit capital to shore up failing institutions. He personally scrutinized the books of various banks and trust companies, deciding which ones were solvent enough to receive aid and which were beyond salvation. His decisive leadership, his personal credibility, and his ability to command the collective action of the nation's wealthiest financiers were instrumental in preventing a total meltdown. He orchestrated emergency loans, facilitated the acquisition of troubled firms, and restored a semblance of order to the markets. This extraordinary intervention, while heroic in its immediate impact, underscored a deeply problematic reality. The stability of the entire American financial system rested precariously on the shoulders of a single private individual and his network. It was a testament to his power, but also a glaring indictment of a system that lacked institutional safeguards. The very fact that such a powerful individual was necessary highlighted the fundamental structural deficiencies that plagued the nation's monetary and banking systems. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was a direct response to these acute challenges, representing a deliberate and monumental effort to construct a more secure, flexible, and centrally managed monetary and banking system for the United States, thereby aiming to prevent the recurrence of the financial chaos that had plagued the nation for over a century. But to truly understand that chaotic era, not as a dry chapter in a history book, but as a lived reality of immense risk and opportunity, one must learn from the men who were in the arena. The titans who navigated those treacherous waters did not have a central bank to rely on. They had only their judgment, their capital, and their courage. Their strategies and first-hand accounts are not mere memories lost to time. They are meticulously documented principles, a masterclass in financial strategy and human psychology. For those who wish to truly understand the methods of these old veterans, there is no greater resource than the complete, unabridged, new edition of 50 Years in Wall Street. This is not simply a book of history. It is a 2-volume mentorship with Henry Clews himself. Within these pages, you will walk side by side with him as he navigates the treacherous currents of the Civil War loans, weathers the very panics we have just discussed, and dissects the methods of titans like Vanderbilt, Drew, and Gould. You will learn to recognize the squalls before they have passed, to cultivate the self-reliance necessary for success, and to understand the true nature of speculation not as a gamble, but as a great productive force in our economy. This new edition, complete with all the original photographs, offers you the chance to gain the experience of a 50-year veteran without paying the market's usual tuition fee of devastating losses. It is an indispensable guide for any man who seeks to command his own financial destiny. The link to acquire this invaluable mentor in print is in the description below this video. The period preceding the Federal Reserve was characterized by persistent financial instability, marked by frequent banking panics and severe economic downturns. These crises were not isolated incidents, but rather a recurring feature of a system that lacked fundamental shock absorbers and a central coordinating authority. The absence of a lender of last resort meant that local disturbances could quickly escalate into national catastrophes, wiping out savings, destroying businesses, and causing widespread unemployment. Understanding these crises is crucial to comprehending the eventual imperative for reform. The Panic of 1819 stands as the first major economic depression in the United States, revealing the nascent vulnerabilities of the young nation's financial system. Its origins can be traced to a post-war of 1812 boom fueled by land speculation and easy credit. Following the war, European demand for American agricultural products surged, driving up commodity prices and encouraging westward expansion. State banks, particularly those on the frontier, eagerly extended credit for land purchases, often issuing banknotes without sufficient specie backing. The Second Bank of the United States, initially lax in its oversight, later adopted a contractionary monetary policy, demanding that state banks redeem their notes in specie. This sudden tightening of credit exposed the fragility of many state banks, which had overextended themselves. As specie flowed out of the country to pay for imports and banks called in loans, a credit crunch ensued. Land values plummeted, banks failed, and businesses collapsed, leading to widespread unemployment and distress. Farmers, unable to sell their crops or meet mortgage payments, faced foreclosures. The panic highlighted the dangers of speculative bubbles and the profound impact of uncoordinated monetary policy on the real economy, signaling that a robust financial infrastructure was essential for national prosperity. The crisis of 1857 provided another stark reminder of the system's fragility. This panic was primarily triggered by a confluence of factors, including the collapse of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, a major financial institution that had invested heavily in speculative railroad stocks. The failure of this prominent firm sent shockwaves through the financial community, eroding confidence and initiating a cascade of withdrawals from other banks. Compounding the issue was the overextension of credit for railroad construction, a booming sector that had attracted significant investment but was becoming increasingly saturated. The sinking of the SS Central America, a steamer carrying approximately 30,000 pounds of gold from California to New York, further exacerbated the crisis by depleting the nation's specie reserves and tightening liquidity at a critical moment. As banks suspended specie payments, a credit crunch gripped the nation. Businesses found it impossible to obtain loans, leading to widespread bankruptcies and a sharp increase in unemployment. Commodity prices, particularly for agricultural goods, fell dramatically, devastating farmers. The crisis underscored the interconnectedness of the financial system and the speed with which a localized shock could propagate throughout the economy, demonstrating the urgent need for a mechanism to inject liquidity and restore confidence during such events. The Long Depression, a protracted period of economic contraction spanning from 1873 to 1896, represented one of the most severe and enduring financial crises in American history. It began with the Panic of 1873, triggered by the collapse of J. Cook and Company, a prominent banking firm deeply involved in financing the Northern Pacific Railway. The overexpansion of the railroad industry, fueled by speculative investment and excessive debt, had created an unsustainable bubble. When Cook's firm failed, it initiated a domino effect. The New York Stock Exchange was forced to close for 10 days, a testament to the severity of the panic. Banks, facing runs from depositors, hoarded reserves and suspended specie payments. The subsequent economic downturn was prolonged and characterized by deflation, high unemployment, and numerous business failures. The crisis was exacerbated by the rigid gold standard, which limited the government's ability to expand the money supply and provide counter-cyclical stimulus. Farmers, already burdened by debt, suffered immensely from falling agricultural prices. The Long Depression highlighted the systemic risks associated with unchecked speculation, particularly in rapidly developing industries like railroads, and revealed the profound difficulty of recovering from a deep recession without flexible monetary policy tools or a central authority to stabilize the financial system. The sheer duration of this economic malaise underscored the profound costs of an unregulated and inflexible banking structure. The Panic of 1907 was arguably the most pivotal event leading directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. This crisis, as previously mentioned, was initiated by a failed speculative attempt to corner the copper market by the United Copper Company. When this attempt collapsed, it led to the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, a large and influential trust company, due to its association with the failed speculation. This failure triggered a widespread loss of confidence, especially in New York City's numerous trust companies, which operated with fewer regulations and lower reserve requirements than national banks. Depositors, fearing for their savings, initiated massive runs on these institutions, leading to a cascade of failures. The panic quickly spread to national banks as well, as the entire financial system became gripped by fear and illiquidity. The stock market plummeted, credit markets froze, and businesses faced severe difficulties obtaining financing. The national banking system, designed to provide a uniform currency, proved utterly incapable of providing the necessary emergency liquidity. Individual banks hoarded their reserves, exacerbating the liquidity crunch rather than lending to struggling institutions. It was in this moment of profound systemic vulnerability that J.P. Morgan, along with other prominent Wall Street bankers, stepped in to organize a private rescue. While their intervention prevented a complete collapse, it was a stark and undeniable demonstration that the nation's financial stability could not reliably depend on the ad hoc actions of private individuals, no matter how powerful or well-intentioned. The panic vividly exposed the critical need for a central institution with the authority and resources to act as a lender of last resort, to manage the money supply, and to instill confidence in the banking system during times of stress. It was the last push that finally forced a consensus for fundamental reform. The consequences of this largely unregulated financial system were severe and far-reaching, impacting every segment of American society. Mass bankruptcies became a recurring feature of economic downturns, affecting both financial institutions and industrial enterprises. Banks, unable to withstand runs or liquidity shortages, would fail, wiping out the savings of countless individuals and businesses. This, in turn, led to the collapse of businesses that relied on these banks for credit or held deposits within them. The ripple effect was devastating, as productive capacity was destroyed and economic activity ground to a halt. A direct and immediate consequence was a sharp increase in unemployment. As businesses failed or significantly curtailed operations due to lack of credit and dwindling demand, workers were laid off en masse. This resulted in widespread economic hardship, poverty, and social unrest. Families struggled to meet basic needs, and the social fabric often frayed under the strain of prolonged joblessness. The absence of a robust social safety net meant that these periods of unemployment were particularly brutal for the working class. Perhaps one of the most corrosive effects was the profound loss of public trust in the banking system and financial institutions generally. Each panic eroded public confidence, making people wary of depositing their money in banks or investing in the stock market. This pervasive distrust hindered capital formation and economic growth, as individuals and businesses chose to hoard cash rather than entrust it to a system perceived as inherently unstable and unreliable. This lack of confidence created a self-fulfilling prophecy, making future panics more likely as depositors would quickly withdraw funds at the first sign of trouble. The frequent financial upheavals also led to a significant outflow of capital. Foreign investors, observing the recurring instability and lack of institutional safeguards, became hesitant to invest in American enterprises. Domestic capital, too, often sought safer havens or remained on the sidelines, further stifling economic expansion. This reduction in available capital limited investment in infrastructure, manufacturing, and innovation, slowing the nation's overall development. Ultimately, the most critical systemic consequence was the inability of the government to effectively respond to financial shocks. Without a central bank, the federal government possessed no sophisticated tools to inject liquidity, stabilize markets, or implement countercyclical monetary policy. Its options were limited to exhortation, hoping that private bankers would act, or relying on fiscal measures that were often too slow and cumbersome to address rapidly unfolding financial crises. This impotence in the face of economic turmoil left the nation vulnerable, prolonging recessions and deepening their impact. The lack of a unified response mechanism meant that each crisis had to be addressed in an ad hoc, often desperate manner, highlighting the fundamental structural weakness of the pre-Fed era. The cumulative experience of these recurring crises, particularly the Panic of 1907, served as the ultimate catalyst for a widespread recognition of the critical need for financial reform. The 1907 panic was the last push, a stark and undeniable demonstration that the existing system was fundamentally broken and unsustainable. The reliance on private individuals like J.P. Morgan, no matter how capable, was seen not as a solution but as a symptom of a deeper systemic flaw. It became clear that the nation could not continue to depend on the benevolence or self-interest of a few powerful financiers to avert economic catastrophe. In the immediate aftermath of the 1907 crisis, public and political pressure for reform became irresistible. Congress responded in 1908 by establishing the National Monetary Commission, a bipartisan body tasked with thoroughly investigating the nation's banking and currency problems and proposing comprehensive solutions. Chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich, the commission embarked on an extensive study, examining central banking systems in Europe and gathering expert testimony from economists, bankers, and policymakers. Their findings unequivocally pointed to the need for a more centralized, flexible, and stable financial structure. The arguments in favor of centralization became increasingly compelling and widely accepted. Proponents highlighted the urgent need for enhanced liquidity provision. A central institution could act as a lender of last resort, supplying emergency funds to solvent banks during panics, thereby preventing localized runs from escalating into systemic crises. This would create a vital safety net for the banking system. Furthermore, a centralized body could ensure greater stability by standardizing banking practices, establishing clear regulatory frameworks, and fostering public confidence. The ability to control and adjust the money supply was another crucial argument. A central bank could expand or contract the currency in response to economic cycles, providing flexibility that the rigid national banking system utterly lacked. This would allow for a more effective response to seasonal demands for cash, as well as to broader economic booms and busts. Finally, centralized control over monetary policy would enable the government to exert a more deliberate and coherent influence over the national economy, promoting sustained growth and mitigating inflationary or deflationary pressures. The consensus forged out of decades of instability and the dramatic events of 1907 made the creation of a central banking system an unavoidable necessity for the nation's future prosperity and stability. In summary, the period preceding the Federal Reserve System's establishment was a testament to the profound challenges inherent in a decentralized and unregulated financial structure. The absence of a central bank left the American economy vulnerable to recurrent banking panics, speculative bubbles, and severe economic depressions. The critical role played by powerful Wall Street financiers, who often stepped in to avert total collapse, highlighted both their immense influence and the inherent fragility of a system that depended on private ad hoc interventions. From the chaotic free banking era to the inflexible national banking system and the devastating panics of 1819, 1857, 1873, and especially 1907, each crisis underscored the urgent need for fundamental reform. The collective experience of these financial upheavals, coupled with the growing understanding of modern monetary principles, ultimately led to a broad consensus for change. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was a direct response to these acute challenges, representing a deliberate and monumental effort to construct a more secure, flexible, and centrally managed monetary and banking system for the United States, thereby aiming to prevent the recurrence of the financial chaos that had plagued the nation for over a century.